Robinson Crusoe Rediscovered. You've all read the book, of course. So I think the expectation was that I'd speak to you guys about field work in Scotland. But having had the privilege of reading a lot of your own work in recent years, I thought, ooh, not sure I want to aspire to the same high level as you folks. I thought I would cheat and give you something completely different. And it gives me an opportunity to deal with another hobby horse of mine, and that is how you can learn an awful lot from looking at objects and archaeological material in the same way as one looks at written records. So in 2005, I ended up on island in the Pacific with these gentlemen here, including Daisuke Takahashi, who was a young Japanese worker from Tokyo who turned up totally unannounced in a museum a few years beforehand because he was interested in the whole story of Robinson Crusoe. He'd read the book and then realised that behind the story was a real-life adventure by one Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish mariner who was marooned on an island in the Pacific from 1704 to 1709. And this caused Daisuke to embark on a whole change of career in life, trying to work out what it was all about. And he's now quite famous in Japan as an author and an adventurer. But he turned up unannounced in the museum. He wanted to see some relics that we had in store relating to Alexander Selkirk. And over the years, I got very friendly with him. And one time he said, do you think we could go to the island where Alexander Selkirk was marooned and find his campsite? And I, in my usual naive way, say, yeah, why not? Let's give it a try. And Daisuke managed to get a very good grant from National Geographic in Washington, other support from the Explorers Club in New York, that's the flag there, and we got very good support from the Chilean authorities, their equivalent, if you like, of Historic Environment Scotland. And I found myself on a plane going to an island in the Pacific, politically part of Chile in 2005, thinking this is absolutely mad. We know that Alexander Selkirk was on this island, but we don't have any more precise information than that. So, Alexander Selkirk. We know a bit about him to some extent from the church session records for Lower Largo, where he's brought up in Fife. Alexander Selkirk was a young Scotsman of a particular type, the sort you didn't want to meet on a Saturday night, drunken, rowdy. The whole family were pretty appalling, frankly, always causing trouble. And he got into trouble with the church, and that occasioned him to disappear from home on more than one occasion. So that's one of the main sources of information we have on him. We also know about him because he, as I say, was a castaway on a Pacific island, and when he was rescued, his rescuers wrote up about him, and there was a period when he was quite famous and quite well known. He was obviously interviewed, spoken to by Daniel Defoe, who in 1719 published this book on Robinson Crusoe. It's not an exact account of Selkirk's life by any means, but there are very salient details which demonstrate that Defoe took on board a lot of what happened to Selkirk. The man who was on an island where there were wild goats, where he lived off the goats and dressed in goat skins, where there were wild cats that he trained, where he tried to look after the goats, and where he led what you might think was an idyllic life until he was eventually rescued. So how did he get out there? Well, in order to escape the wrath of the church authorities, he ended up joining an expedition to go to sea. And in 1703, he was on a ship called the Cinque-Port Galley at Kinsale in the south of Ireland, about to sail with another ship captained by William Dampier, two ships together going to prey on the Spanish Main in the Pacific. We were at war with Spain, and this was legitimate piracy, if you like. Dampier, interesting character. He was quite famous in his time for writing a book about traveling around the world, which caught a lot of people's imagination. I suspect he was probably a bit like Jack Sparrow, as in the Pirates of the Caribbean. A rather effete and not a very effective person. And the two ships, they didn't operate well with each other. The commanders of the ships fell out. There was all sorts of problems. But that was the context for Selkirk going on this voyage. Now, it was not an untrodden path as far as piracy and privateering was concerned, as far as ships from England and France were concerned. You left Europe, you travelled down the Atlantic, went round the bottom of South America, and you aimed for this island, which the Chileans now rather proudly call Robinson Crusoe Island. It used to be called Juan Fernandez. It's about 400 miles out in the Pacific from the coast of South America. It's only about 13 by 5 miles in maximum extent. It's a bit like a knife edge, a volcanic knife edge rising to a height of about 3,000 foot. And it was a good place to, once you'd, sort of crossed the oceans, a good place to regroup. You were well away from prying Spanish eyes. There was good quality water. There's a population of goats, lots of vegetables, and wood for effecting repairs to your ships. And there was a reasonably sheltered bay on the island, the only place where you could moor ship, which is where the present population of a few hundred now live. And most of the island was otherwise fairly inaccessible. It was covered with equatorial forest, if you like. Apart from the feral goats, lots of hummingbirds, lots of good resources in fish in the sea, but not really all that much else. And very difficult to get round the island. If you were, landed at this bay by ship, you probably would find it very difficult to get anywhere else on the island at all. So anyway, this is what the expedition did after leaving Kinsale. They got here, they regrouped. The two ships, the two captains had fallen out with each other. The two ships went their separate ways, and the whole voyage was a miserable failure. They failed to find good quality Spanish prizes. And later in the year 1704, the ship that Selkirk was on returned here to actually undertake repairs. By this time, Selkirk had also totally fallen out with a lot of the rest of the people on the ship, including the captain, who at that time was one Thomas Stradling. And Selkirk basically said to Stradling, I don't like you. I think your ship's going to sink. I don't want to go any further with you. Just leave me behind. And Stradling said, OK, Selkirk, might see you later. Bye-bye. And off he went, leaving Selkirk all by himself on this island in the Pacific. Absolutely no other humans there. And incidentally, this island there's absolutely no evidence of human occupation of it prior to its discovery by the Spaniards in the late 16th century. Now, it's obviously a very rash thing for Selkirk to have done, but he was right. The ship did sink. It didn't get back to Britain. So therefore, any word that had been left there didn't get back to anybody who might know about it. And it wasn't necessarily so terribly rash, because he might reasonably have expected that other pirates or privateers would turn up reasonably soon and rescue him. There was some evidence that he would have known about of other people being abandoned on the island for a period of time, so he knew it was possible to live there. One of these people was a Mosquito Indian from the Caribbean called Will, who is presumably the model for Man Friday in the Robinson Crusoe story, but he was there prior to Selkirk being on the island. So Selkirk was stuck in the island for 4 years. First, a total almost meltdown by his own admission, totally scared, didn't know what to do, and eventually settled down. and had developed a lifestyle. Typical Scotsman, although the main sources of food on the island were probably fish, didn't like fish. Um, and But he was all right with goats, and eventually got dressed in goat skins. We know that he'd taken from the boat with him a gun, his Bible, his navigational equipment, his navigational books, and we'll come back to that, tobacco, and a sea chest, and various other things. And he settled down to what he terms a very godly life, reading the Bible every day, singing hymns, chasing after goats, and avoiding detection, because there's always a risk that Spanish forces would land on the island, as they did twice, and capture him and either kill him outright or put him into slavery in the mines in South America. But he managed to survive there single-handed for 4 years. Now, his background, I alluded to very slightly, a bit of a bad lad of a particular Scottish type, but he clearly had an education. Um, and he could read, he could write, and he had mathematical knowledge. And in fact, it appears he was actually the master of the ship he sailed on, not the actual captain in our terms, but the man who was responsible for taking all the readings and doing the navigation. And when he was rescued, his rescuers recognised that he had skills of that type. The house that he was brought up in is now gone. The church is still there, and the Kirk Session records in the library at St Andrews, which tell the rather sorry tale of what a bad bunch the Selkirks were. But what brought Daisuke over to Edinburgh in the first place were two relics, which, sad to say, the National Museum have not had on display for a very long time. And one of those relics is what we used to call a coconut cup. There it is, a nut carved, mounted on a stem and with a silver mount. They were put on by Sir Walter Scott in the early 19th century. And they were given to the museum by the local landlord, who obviously just took them away from the family, said, I can look after these for you, and they ended up in the museum. And I've tried my best to identify where this nut came from. I thought it might be from the island itself, but I don't think that's the case. And it may come from somewhere like Madagascar. We did try the Botanic Gardens a number of years ago, but we need to push that one a bit further. The Madagascar reference, I think, is interesting because there's some evidence that Selkirk may, before he ended up in the island, have been involved in one of the greatest piratical enterprises of all time, when Harry Avery captured the daughter of the Shah of Persia and went off to Madagascar and had himself claimed king there. The other relic is a sea chest, which may look rather dull, but it's actually a rather fine piece of furniture. And the interesting thing about this is it's a very particular type of chest, which we can say was made in a Finel do Burgo, I think it's called, up in Livorno, up in the northwest of Italy. It's a particular area that produces these chests from an early time. They're called Spanish chests. Don't ask, I don't know, okay? And the significance of this is that the ship that Selkirk was master on to sail to the Pacific was captained by one Charles Pickering, who was operating various nefarious activities out of the port of Livorno in Italy up to 1703, and eventually things got so hot for him that he had to go all the way to the Pacific to escape the long arm of the law. And Selkirk presumably was his master, his protege, if you like, and the chest, I think, was some way to give you that explanation. If I'd been in the museum longer, I would like to have, sort of studied the bottom of the chest to see if there's any, sort of evidence at the bottom of it of local soil from the island, but we never got that far. But that to me is one of the interesting things of working in a museum, is if you can make objects speak to you in this sort of way. So we showed you earlier on William Dampier, the leader of the expedition that got Selkirk out to the Pacific. The man who rescued him was a Bristol merchant, Woodes Rogers. Again, no different from a lot of these other guys. One day they were pirates, another day they were privateers, and sometimes they ended up making good, like they became governor of the Bahamas and looking very respectable. Woodes Rogers went to the island in 1709, and this and Selkirk realised it was English ships, lit a fire and appeared and was rescued by Woodes Rogers and was taken very seriously as being a good man, and ended up being part of a very successful expedition and making quite a lot of money out of it before sailing a Spanish prize ship all the way back to London. So, Selkirk was famous for a while when he got back to London. There was a lot of interest in him. He had money. He departed from his good old Christian ways that he developed on the island, became a bit of a reprobate again, and ended up joining the British Navy, and died of yellow fever on HMS Weymouth off the coast of Ghana in 1719 at Cape Coast, actually, unaware that by that time he would have been very famous because Defoe had written the book which essentially featured so much about him. Some of you may recognise this guy here, Nigel Ruckley, very much involved in a lot of our Scottish archaeological enterprises. We were there a few years beforehand before we knew that this was going to be of any interest to us. Anyway, if you're going to be stranded anywhere for any length of time, you could choose worse than Robinson Crusoe Island, as it's now called, covered with forestry like this, lots of edible berries and vegetables, some planted by European settlers, good water, very good climate all year round. Now some of it has been, very much ruined by later activity, but the island is run by CONAF, the Chilean Forestry Commission, which is doing its best to actually conserve the vegetation like this, which made our exploits very difficult because we did get permission to excavate, provided we didn't remove or uproot any of the indigenous plant life, trees. Quite difficult. The island has a small population, I think about 300 or something like that, of settlers from the mainland of South America who got there in the middle of the 19th century. They therefore had no, if you like, memory or knowledge of what was happening on the island in earlier times. And communications with the mainland are quite difficult. We were looked after by a family of fishermen. This is Senora Julia, who fed us. It was really tough going. I mean, every day we had to eat lobsters and drink Chilean wine. Wasn't there much else? I mean, it's quite odd. At the end of the first week, Senora served us up spaghetti bolognese, and I actually thought, oh, great, mince is made with lobsters. But they were good, and the wine was good. And lots of sea life round about, but of no interest to Selkirk, apparently. So just one settlement in Cumberland Bay, where it's possible for ships to come into the bay. There's one or two cruise ships turning up now, but they can't get close in, and there's absolutely nothing on the island for them. No roads, no shops, no cafes, nothing really for them to do. The main form of communication is a very irregular service by the Navarino from Valparaiso, slightly bigger than a Clyde puffer. Apparently it's a real gut-wrenching voyage of several days to get to the island, which we managed to avoid because we went by plane. A very irregular service in this little 4 or 5 seater that sometimes leaves from Santiago in Chile, The captain has to get in radio communication with somebody in the island to check whether he thinks it's safe to land, because he can't carry enough fuel to turn back if he doesn't actually make it. It meant that it was quite an interesting, sort of experience, and we're very limited with the amount of equipment we could take. Basically, no surveying equipment apart from a measuring tape and lengths of string. We'll come to that later on. Um, and the plane lands on a strip of land at one end of the island, well away from the settlement. And it was bad enough the plane landing, trying to get its wheels on the edge of the cliff, so it had enough room to stop before going off the other end of the island. It was then a horribly interesting little voyage in an open boat round these cliffs to get to the settlement. That's it there. Having to slow down every so often to stop the boat being swamped. I'm really building up a good picture here of what a great tourist destination it is or should be. So as for its history, no sign of human population until the 16th century, only really settled by peasants from the mainland in the 19th century. The descendants still there, but very much used by bad people like our ancestors, to the extent that the Spaniards built a fort about 1750. There it is, overlooking the bay. And it was a good place to dump political prisoners. Anybody who ever made it in politics in Chile probably spent some time living in the caves or on the beach on this island before they actually got back home. And the other thing that the island is famous for is in 1915, British battleships, including HMS Glasgow, cornered the Dresden in the island here and started shelling it to blazes until the Germans scuttled it. And that attracts quite a lot of attention as well. So it's like a knife edge rising out of the sea. That's the top of the island. It really is that severe. And even now, even though a lot of the island's cleared, very difficult to get to most of it. No roads, no vehicles, apart from wheelbarrows. So quite tough going. One of the other things we know is that top of the ridge, which is now called El Mirador, the lookout, seems to relate to what Selkirk told his rescuers, and that is that on a daily basis he climbed to the top of the island to look for potential threats and for ships that might come and rescue him. And this appears to be the spot. That has been reinforced by this plaque that was put up by the Royal Navy, our Royal Navy, in the 1860s. So there are other parts of the island which have been looked at by other people as possible places. There is a cave which was partially explored archaeologically a number of years ago. But there's absolutely no evidence that Selkirk could get to this part of the island or ever had anything to do with a cave. I think that relates to the Robinson Crusoe book rather than Selkirk's actual life. Selkirk, I think, described to his rescuers about how he would doodle on trees, leave inscriptions. I don't know what he was saying, I love Scotland or stuff like that. So we were aware that a number of the trees had carvings on them, and we tried to make something of them, like these carvings here. Our best conclusion, though, is that this is the settlers in the 19th century identify trees for their own use. Some of the island which has been cleared, we could see how there were old paths and with some rocks, sometimes with inscriptions on them. Now we're looking here at coming out of the settlement, San Juan Bautista, heading towards there's El Mirador, the lookout post that Selkirk says he climbed to every day. And we were trying to work out where the path system were, some of them which might be quite early, and see if we could see any other evidence of Selkirk's activity. And we did, frankly, because we were on the island for 4 weeks, and some of us we didn't really think we were going to find that much. So we were desperately keen to do the best we could with what presented itself. So we used some cunning Oriental techniques to take impressions of some of the graffiti that we saw. There were one or two AS graffiti, which I refused to believe in, and there were others which clearly related to German sailors who had been abandoned there after 1915. But we did our best to get some understanding. But the key thing we had to go on was that Daisuke had actually visited the island a few years before 2005. He was quite keen on the idea that he could try and recreate the sort of life that Selkirk must have had. And he got friendly with an old fisherman who showed him a clearing in the forest. This is it here, where, and unfortunately the picture was taken after we'd done some clearance work, where he thought there was some evidence that there might have been a house at some time. So all I had to go on from Daisuke was he showed me these pictures of a clearing in the forest. He explained how it compared with how Selkirk described where he was living on the island, well away from the shore, within reasonable reach of this lookout. Take you well over an hour to get from here up there, given the state of the vegetation, by the way, and whether he thought there was some evidence of a house, and thought, well, okay, it's worth a try. Well, we got the money, so we had to go and do something about it. And I remember we met up with the Chilean archaeologists who we were required to work along with. And by the way, this could easily have been one of these stories of the expedition that went wrong, where everybody was fighting with each other, but we all got on great. It really worked very well, despite language problems. But anyway, we got to the first day we got on the island. I went with my Chilean colleagues and Daisuke up to see this site. And we saw this site, and we saw what looked like evidence of, a little rectangular house of some sort. And I gave a knowing look to the Chilean archaeologist. I thought, aye, this will be right. But we had no other plans, nothing else to go on. So we thought, well, we'll excavate this and see what we can make of it. There's our initial plan. It was on a site, a sort of surrounded by fresh water. It'd obviously been a site that had been flattened artificially by human intervention. Foundations of walls, clay walls faced with stone, probably whitewashed. These are still all the trees in place that we thought we couldn't possibly destroy or get rid of. That's how it actually looked. And that was the sort of information we were dealing with. And as we excavated, we made out various other things about it. It lay east-west. It had a porch area, cobbled area out the front. There's quite a lot of evidence for pottery, bricks, the bricks forming a brick floor inside the building, I think, roof tiles. And these bricks and roof tiles and bits of pottery, none of which looked like they particularly had a domestic look about it. There wasn't any sort of domestic debris, but it looked exactly like the debris down at the Spanish fort, down at the shore, which dated to 1750. So we're fairly sure we had an 18th century building. We thought, well, at least we're doing some archaeology, getting something out of this. And our first inclination was to think, actually, it was a little church, to be honest, on an east-west orientation. And we were aware that there were other churches like this elsewhere in remote parts of Chile, and that the island had actually been owned by the Jesuit order for some length of time. And we thought, well, maybe this is a place where Jesuit priests went on retreat. But we found out what it was before we left the island from a map in the library. A late 18th century map, which clearly identified it as being a powder store. Now, my conclusion is it's not a powder store in the sense it was where they kept barrels of gunpowder a significant distance away from their fort, but it may be where they had expeditions going out to gather charcoal and bird droppings and other material in order to make the gunpowder they needed for their guns down in the fort. And that was it. So we had a story. This is interesting, an early example of colonization. on an island that had never been occupied by humans before. And we still had 2 weeks to go where we could do something, and no clues, no other ideas of what we could do or where we could go, no other leads at all. So what we did, which I think is archaeologists sometimes do, is we decided to keep on digging. So that was what we did. But before we come to that, I mean, it's worth just reflecting for a moment. What did we think we were going to find anyway? You know, did we think we were going to find a sporran or, some Scottish clay pipes or something like that? It's pretty clear Selkirk could not have built by himself a little rectangular house of that type. It just wasn't on. What we did have to go on was a description by his rescuers, which describes how up in the forest, Selkirk had built himself 2 huts, one to act as a kitchen and the other to live in. Okay. And what did a hut look like for Selkirk? Well, going back to how things were in Scotland in Selkirk's time, where there was a tradition in many parts of Scotland of taking the cattle away in the summer to the shearings. These are the sort of huts that we know that were built. This is a Jura. This is a drawing that's in Thomas Pennant's volume of 1774. So wigwam-like structures covered in turf. Was this the sort of thing that Selkirk was capable of building? Huts like this, but instead of having turf, covered with grass and goat skins, which is what he described. And it is a case that on shealing sites, at least in the west of Scotland, there often was a tradition that you had paired shearings, that you had one that you actually lived in, the family group lived in, and the other one was where you stored all your dairying utensils and your cheese and the butter, whatever else you were doing. Was that the sort of thing that Selkirk would have done? He had a very limited amount of equipment. It would have been absolutely remarkable if he'd found his gun or his axe or anything like that. That'd have been extremely careless and very unlikely that he would have left stuff like that lying around. But that was the sort of, it was very limited information to go on, really, as to what we should expect. But when we actually looked under the floor of this powder store, that is the floor there in place there. We supported a brick. It had a laid brick floor, I think. Underneath it, we found evidence of other things happening. Clearly earlier than about 1750, whether it was 2 days earlier, 50 years earlier, or 2,000 years earlier wasn't immediately clear. But one of the more obvious things we found, is partially sticking out, was this sort of pit, sort of gentle pit, which was full of little bits of charcoal and little bits of burnt bone. There's some evidence that there'd been stone round about that. Now, actually, if you go along the beaches in Fife and no doubt over the west of Scotland, you see things like this where people have been lighting barbecues on the beach during the summer months. You have your barbecue in one place, you clear out all the ash, and you do a new barbecue, you put in new wood or whatever, and as time goes on, you create a sort of hollow, and it's full of all this sort of debris. So we were onto something here. At least we had some evidence of some earlier activity. And we found another nearby. This is actually the threshold into the powder store. We found evidence of another pit of similar sort, which is stones round it, all these ash deposits, and that's the entrance into the place, and that's it sticking out from under the threshold. And we did actually get a radiocarbon date eventually from this, from a bit of charcoal from here, which all things being equal would have suggested that the wood had died about 1650. All sorts of complications about that. But we don't know how old a bit of wood it was, or anything about it. But at least, well, we're in interesting territory here. At least we're getting somewhere, we thought. Just a little bit of an extra story. And we also found some evidence for little stake holes in the ground. Not enough to show what sort of structure we're dealing with, but there they are, little that would have supported the sort of stakes that one man could stick together and tie together in the top to make some sort of structure. Uh, Whether the two fireplaces are the same date, whether it's several different episodes, I don't know. But at least we thought, well, my goodness, this is better than we could seriously have hoped for. And but we only found one object, one artifact. We were sieving everything, like this, and out came this tiny little bit of copper alloy. You can see how small it is there. And I pulled it out, put it in a bag, and off we went back home for the day. A good hour, I think, to get us from the site back down to the settlement. And the next day, I was going up to the site later than the others for a variety of reasons. And halfway up the hill, I stopped in my tracks. I thought, I know what that is. I know absolutely what that is that we found. I had to wait a whole day to go back and look at it again. Because what I think we discovered was the tip from a pair of navigational dividers like this. The tip was shaped in such a way that two parts put together would make a point. Now, navigational dividers like this are reasonably well known. We've actually got several in the museum in Edinburgh, from HMS Dartmouth, which sank off Mull in 1690, and there's been several others found over the years. It was a sort of arrangement where you could hold the navigator, the instrument in one hand while you did other work. This, incidentally, is one of the paintings from Burnt Island Church down the road from where I stay, with a sort of navigator or master of the type that Selkirk would presumably have been. Now, Woodes Rogers, when he rescued Selkirk, specifically said that he had his navigational equipment and his books with him. And, as I say, if we found a stone which said, Alexander Selkirk, I was here, or a Scottish coin, you might think, aye, that will be right. But finding something like this, I think, is very believable. There's this man all by himself, using the dividers for something which they weren't meant for, and the point pings off. The air roundabout, no doubt, turns totally blue, and he doesn't find the point at all. We brought it back to Edinburgh for analysis. It was returned to the island. The island has since suffered a tsunami. I don't know what's happened to the material left there, but I think it's a very interesting sort of find. And we wrote all this up. It's published in the Journal Post-Medieval Archaeology. For a while, me and Daisuke in our college were quite famous. We were being chased after by TV colleagues and people like Der Spiegel, even in Germany, to do interviews. And we had a great time. I thought there was quite a serious risk at one time that we might get invited back to go and do more archaeology, because there's so many other things we could have followed up. And we certainly tried to recommend to the Chilean government that they should really do more about the infrastructure on the island. Because you could create facilities for cruise ships. It would be possible to make arrangements for people to get from the shore, from there up to this campsite. So I don't know where that is going. I haven't had any recent contact with these people. But so what, you might be saying? I had a great time. We all had a great time. It was a great boys' own adventure. Sorry, it was all boys. There were no women there, which is sad in lots of good ways, by the way. We had a great time. It was a good bit of work. And perhaps it's a teensy-weensy little bit of archaeology about colonialisation. But I think it's much more important than that in many ways, because the whole idea of being a castaway, being a Robinson Crusoe type figure, is actually so deeply rooted in Western society. I mean, how many of you can honestly say that at some time or other when you were at work, you didn't look out the window and think, oh, if only I was on a desert island somewhere, or playing my desert island discs for Sue Lolly or whoever it was that did it by that stage, or something or other. But that was the whole of this episode, the Robinson Crusoe book actually shaped our mindset, the way we think about escaping and doing other things. There was always an industry of people writing imagined diaries of what it was like to be Selkirk. It's something that's still eluded to me. There is circumstantial evidence that Selkirk did keep a diary, and there are some survive, but so far the ones we've seen or come across are obviously bogus. But somewhere there might just possibly be a diary that the man kept for himself. And I think that is one of the key things about it, is that it's a way it has shaped the way we think, our feelings of escapism, an ideal way of life. And that's all down to this rather unlikely, wild lad from Lower Largo in Fife. And we should be very grateful that it's a story that we recognise. Thank you very much.